Sorry about that. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm Joe DeStefano, Senior Director for Policy Systems and Governance in International Education at RTI International. I hope all of you are staying safe, healthy, and happy during this particularly challenging time. And I'm happy to welcome you to today's panel, which is part of a RISE series on teaching and the teaching profession. We will be focusing on approaches to teacher training and coaching. To meet the challenge of the current learning crisis, which I'm sure all of you have been reading about and researching about yourselves, instruction in the vast majority of the world's classrooms needs to improve and improve dramatically. But in many education systems, a substantial portion of teachers do not adequately master either the material nor the pedagogical methods that are necessary for conveying that material to students. Teacher training and coaching are the principal ways that we all try to address those shortcomings. This session highlights the complexity of delivering effective teacher training and offers some useful lessons and insights for education systems. All four of the programs that were studied by today's panelists are vast improvements over typical one-off in-service training or cascade models. Supporting teacher professional development is something every education system has to do, and there are a number of policy and operational challenges that need to be addressed for effective teacher professional development to be consistently supported at scale. All four of the programs that we will discuss experience a mix of success and shortcomings, but all of that will inform how we address teacher professional development needs going forward. Today's session will be run in the following way. We'll begin with each member of the panel briefly summarizing the key takeaways from their research. After that, we'll have a discussion among the panel members. We'll reserve 15 minutes toward the end of the session for the panel to respond to questions which participants will have posted in the Q&A portion of the Zoom window. So please use that function that you see at the bottom of the Zoom window to pose your questions. It will be helpful if you can indicate the panelist or panelists your question is directed to. And please keep to one question per post so that we can easily sort through all the questions that do get put into that window. I'd like to briefly introduce our panel and then we can get started. Janeli Kotze is in the research directorate of the Department of Basic Education and has been working on early grade reading studies that are being conducted by that department since 2015. She will be telling us about the virtual versus in-person approaches to coaching in South Africa. Andy Barros is a postdoctorate associate at MIT's Department of Economics, where he works with teaching at the right level in Africa and JPAL South Asia. He specializes in program evaluation and evidence-based policy and carries out research on teacher effectiveness. He'll share today his findings on training on activity-based approaches to math instruction with additional insight into the advantage and limitations of parent community engagement in supporting improved instruction. Todd Pugatch is an associate professor of economics at Oregon State University. His work focuses on education policy in developing countries, and he has studied teacher training to support entrepreneurship instruction in Rwanda and has looked at its impact on teacher adoption of more active methods and the impact of those methods on student entrepreneurial activities. And lastly, Charlotte Jones is the global head of R&D at the Education Development Trust, where she oversees research and learning on the impact of the charities programs worldwide. And Charlotte will inform us about teacher communities of practice at the school level in Rwanda and cluster level in Kenya. Janeli, I invite you to please begin.
Thank you, Joe. Good day. Very fitting for a virtual conference. I'm speaking about a paper that looked at virtual coaching and where they can be as effective as in-person coaching in changing instructional practice and subsequently early grade reading outcomes. This research follows on from a prior study that we've done to show that in-person coaching is effective in changing home language outcomes in South Africa. And in this study, we explored whether virtual coaching can be a more resource-effective way in scaling up structured learning programs with coaching. The main finding in this paper is that virtual coaching was unfortunately not as effective as in-person coaching. And we saw this both in terms of learning outcomes and in terms of teachers' instructional practices. The big question that this left us with is why? Why was virtual coaching not as effective as in-person coaching? We first considered whether technology was a barrier, but we did not find this to be the case. We also looked at whether quality of implementation was an issue, and again, found no evidence of this. And finally, we investigated the very nature of in-person coaching and found that firstly, the in-person coach had a much better chance of building a trust relationship with teachers, which made teachers much more open to receiving feedback and then subsequently changing their instructional practices. Secondly, we also realized that the in-person coach brought with her an element of peer accountability. Being in the classroom, she could see what the teacher was doing and she could provide much more targeted feedback to the teacher. And our recommendation based on this research is that if people want to consider virtual coaching as an effective way of supporting teachers, especially in this time, a blended model is definitely needed. You need some in-person visits to ensure that virtual coaching can be effective. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Janeli. I believe we go to you, Andy, next.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you very much to the organizers and the RISE team for inviting me to speak. I'm presenting on a study where we evaluate the large-scale scale-up of a program that aims to promote activity-based math instruction in public primary schools in southern India and Karnataka. And the program does that by promoting teaching and learning materials to schools and training teachers on how to use those materials in their classrooms. We do that, and we also evaluate another version of the same program that adds community events. And after 15 months, we find that the results favor the version without the events. And we find improvements both in terms of teaching quality of about 15% of the standard deviation, and in terms of positive effects on math learning in terms of 12, in the scale of 12% of the standard deviation. We find that those positive effects are fully driven by effects among girls, with close to zero effects among boys. We look at very rich information in between the intervention and just student test score outcomes. And for example, we also found that both versions improve student attitudes towards math, meaning how they feel about mathematics, about their class, how much it makes them nervous, in terms of 11% of the standard deviation. But when you look at the version that also adds the community events, we actually find that at least in one dimension of instructional quality, that intervention had a negative effect on classroom culture of 12% of the standard deviation. So I think that the bigger picture here shows that at least for this program, we have a supply-side program that just provides additional inputs and actually a fairly traditional approach to teacher training. And that those approaches can have a positive effect on the student learning, including at a very large scale, as long as it remains focused on bettering instructional quality.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andy. Todd, do you go next, please?
Sure, thanks very much. Happy to be here today. So the context of this work is an ambitious system-wide curriculum reform that Rwanda launched in 2016. Rwanda has required entrepreneurship as a secondary school subject for a number of years, and the required entrepreneurship course was part of this curricular reform. The new curriculum focused on active learning and practical skills, and it's this system-wide curricular reform that ties in most directly with the theme of RISE. Now, that said, this research doesn't test the curriculum itself because it went to all schools. Instead, we evaluate an experimental intervention that provided intensive training and support to entrepreneurship teachers in a subset of secondary schools. And the idea here is that teachers might be unprepared for such dramatic curricular changes in the absence of more intensive training and support. And we find, in line with the goal of the experimental intervention, increases in the use of active teaching techniques. And we also find some important student outcomes. Students in treated schools were more likely to start businesses to the tune of 5 percentage points on a control mean of 30%. And some preliminary results indicate that these increases persisted after students left secondary school. Now, the flip side of this is that we also saw declines in wage employment among treated students, and this left overall income unchanged. Bringing it back to teachers, though, this is some promising evidence that intensive training and support can lead to pedagogical changes in the context of a dramatic curricular reform.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Todd. And thanks, everyone so far. Charlotte, I think you can wrap us up with the summary of your research.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thanks to the RISE team as well. So I'm presenting on some early findings from a study called Teachers Learning Together. And this is joint research with 2 delivery teams at Education Development Trust. The study looks at communities of practice as a teacher CPD intervention in 2 large-scale programs. One's in Kenya and the other one in Rwanda. And over 3,500 schools are taking part in total. So to set the context in terms of the communities of practice intervention, in both countries, as opposed to being trained in a kind of traditional format at an event, teachers learn together, hence the name of the study, in peer groups, which take place regularly in the school setting and which are supported by aspects such as toolkits on new instructional practices and inputs from coaches or subject experts. So the study, ultimately, we're going to be looking at the impact of the interventions once we get to N-line in 2021. But another really important element of the study and the focus of this RISE paper is also the relationship between this kind of teacher collaborative learning and different kinds of leadership. So, for example, the role of coaches, head teachers, and subject leads. And I think the reason for this is that if we can understand the role of these actors and what they can do to kind of create the conditions for improved teacher instruction and COPs, communities of practice, then I think that can help us understand how to scale policies in this area. So let me just pick out a couple of early insights from the baseline and a few months into the interventions as well. And to note, we're at early stages, so we're simply exploring correlations at this time to identify areas of interest. So firstly, we found a positive correlation between facilitation quality and the self-reported impact by teachers of communities of practice on teaching quality. And secondly, we did quite a lot of analysis at this stage on different leadership roles and styles that teachers benefit from. And we really found that there's no one size fits all. So for example, teachers may benefit from quite directive inputs from head teachers when COPs are quite new, quite young, but that this kind of style may actually stifle effective peer collaboration when the COPs are a little more established. So I think an early takeaway at this stage, yeah, we can say really that there's no one size fits all for leadership inputs that can support teacher professional development.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlotte. And through some miracle, we are slightly ahead of schedule. So thanks to all the panelists for doing such a good job succinctly summarizing the main takeaways from your research. I think this collection of studies, you know, just having to listen to the 4 of you and think about that, I think they're particularly pertinent for right now in, you know, the in-person versus virtual or technology-based coaching is obviously a critical issue these days as we search for more cost-effective ways to support teachers, even leaving aside the constraints caused by the worldwide pandemic. The idea of looking at whether community engagement enhanced or didn't what was trying to be done on the instructional side. I think a lot of programs around the world promote community engagement and parental engagement as a dimension of supporting school improvement. So I think gaining some insight from what Andy's study found will be helpful as well. The questions of communities of practice, you were just talking about, Charlotte, I think that's a growing area of interest and is seen as another way to support teacher professional development within peer groups. And I left out, and Todd's study I think is really interesting because it's one that doesn't only look at outcomes in terms of in school, but also outcomes after students leave school. So I think we have a rich body of studies to draw on here for our discussion. And so I'll open it up by just asking the panel and just you can raise your hand or indicate if you want to go first on answering this. Just based on the study and your research, what do you think are the most important implications for the systems where the programs are being implemented, as well as more broadly for education systems around the world? Who wants to kick us off?
I'll be happy to start. So as I mentioned in my brief summary of the research, the link to the system component in this work is the context of this ambitious curricular reform that happened in Rwanda, where essentially overnight teachers were asked to pivot from their traditional knowledge-based approach to one that was focused on active instructional techniques and practical skills. And this was particularly dramatic in the context of the entrepreneurship curriculum, which we study. And so a lesson here is that training, the status quo training that is not subject specific is insufficient to support teachers to make that kind of change. Some additional subject specific training, there's a community as a practice component in the intervention we study, as well as outreach, direct outreach to teachers seems to be important to help teachers change their pedagogical techniques. The other piece that I didn't mention yet is there is a misalignment in the Rwandan context between the focus on assessment and exams with this new curricular approach. The exams continued to follow the more traditional knowledge accumulation model that was out of sync with this emerging focus on practical skills. And until those pieces are well aligned, it makes it particularly challenging for teachers to change their instructional techniques.
Yeah, I think that that last point you made, Todd, is particularly interesting. It's one often, there's a lag between the curricular reform and then the exam reform, and kind of helping Rwanda to address that if they really want those changes to take root is going to be critical. Anyone else want to get in on this in terms of the main system implications of your research?
I'd be happy to chip in.
Please.
Yeah, I think from our study at this stage, the most important implications more broadly are around the importance of leadership, I think, in scaling teacher CPD interventions. So I think if you're a policymaker and you're investing in CPD for teachers, which can be a really big investment, on the basis of this research so far, I would really urge you to also invest in the leaders and the facilitators of that CPD, whether that's district officials, pedagogical coaches, head teachers. I really think we need to pay more attention to the professional skills that other members of the workforce need to enable teachers, and I think even the most brilliant CPD models can fail at scale if we don't kind of get a hold of this hard wiring of the delivery structure. So yeah, let's pay more attention to the wider workforce and think of it as something that will, I guess, almost protect or kind of unlock the investment that policymakers are making in teachers.
Charlotte, let me ask you, because one of the things, and sorry, Andy, but just a quick follow-up with Charlotte on one of the things, communities of practice are seen as a way to not have to rely on sort of an external support to promote teacher professional development, or at least in part, right? And so speak a little bit about the role of that leadership within that context in particular. Yeah. So do you see that primarily coming from, for example, school heads or principals?
Yeah, good question. In fact, the two models are different. So in Kenya, the model is a cluster-based model where teachers come together from across 5 schools, and that is actually facilitated by an instructional coach. And actually, they are like a proper facilitator, and they provide expert feedback and so on as well. And we actually found the teachers were potentially less able to step up and kind of set the agenda themselves and provide the teacher leadership. So there's something interesting going on there. In Rwanda, it's different. So the communities of practice are in each school. And at the beginning, the head teachers were quite active in sort of supervising the communities of practice, making sure they happened, kind of setting the rhythm, I suppose. But over time, the teachers, as you suggest, Joe, they really sort of took control, and they're a little bit more self-organizing. They do have some external inputs, and I think that is in line with the wider international evidence as well. You don't want to just keep recycling poor practice, but actually they're quite, they just sort of need a little nudge here and there. So I think we're seeing that developing at the moment in Rwanda.
Excellent, thank you. Go ahead, Andy.
Right, so I want to add, I think from our study, I think the most important implication is just the importance of focusing on instructional quality. And it's actually striking how little that has been done in prior work. So we first provide very rich evidence on doing exactly that. So we have over 1,600 classroom observations, for example, just providing very rich descriptive evidence of what instruction looks like in an Indian classroom, and we can document how far the Indian system is from providing high quality instruction. But then beyond that, I think we also show that this focus really shows that the debate of input versus no input or additional interventions is really a false dichotomy, showing that it should be about an intervention that improves instructional quality versus not. And if that requires input, then so be it. If there's a high input intervention that does not improve instructional quality, then there's no worth in that intervention. But it's not about input versus no input, it's about whether an intervention improves instructional quality, and really for the system to stay extremely focused on this instructional quality and its link of this instructional quality to then student learning.
Yeah, I think that's really a good point, Andy. The relationship between the introduction of materials and then how teachers make productive use of those in their classroom, right? I remember studies we did several years ago looking across about 10 or 12 community-based interventions. And one of the things we were looking for was whether there was presence of reading materials, student books in classrooms. And what we saw, rather disappointingly, was that there was a high level of presence of materials, but a low level of use. And so the issue, obviously, was, are teachers adequately trained in how to use the materials that are part of the inputs of a program? So I think that point you're making is really helpful, Andy. Janeli, did you want to get in?
Well, so I think I'm building on exactly what you said, and that was definitely our experience as well. Is I think I was surprised at how difficult it is to change teacher instructional practice, even with coaching, structured lesson plans, high-level training. Teachers are very slow to change their practices, and they are most likely to change the practices that's most familiar to them. But the more difficult practices take a lot of intense training for them to actually change. And I realized that essentially what we're asking someone is we're asking them to do something that they've been doing every day for the last 10, 15, 20 years to start doing that differently. So with any other skill that requires coaching, I think that is what we've learned, is that there's a lot of inputs that need to happen for a teacher to actually be brave enough to try something in front of a class. And then once she's tried it, to try it again if it didn't work well. And there's almost an emotional process that's linked to that we need to take in consideration. So I think for any intervention to really work, there needs to be a very strong theory of change, of actually how is this going to play out in the teacher's classroom and how is she going to be implementing it.
Great, thank you very much. The next question, the really addresses the issue of scale. And when you consider the implications of the findings of your studies, how do you think they raise operational issues that may need to be addressed if they're to be implemented at, say, national scale? I know, Todd, the Rwanda example is a national curriculum reform, but if the kind of training that was going to be provided, for example, were to be provided at national scale, what would be some of the particular operational challenges? If you want to speak to that.
Sure. So there were three main components of this program. One was intensive training, 12 days a year, including practice of these new structured lessons. The second was what were known as exchange visits, or what Charlotte refers to as communities of practice, where teachers are observing each other and giving each other feedback. And then the third component was outreach from the implementing NGO. And those components have different implications for scale up. So the first, kind of the intensive training, you can imagine that being scaled up. It did follow a cascade model, and the idea is to hand it over to government trainers to the extent possible. Implementation quality could suffer as that handoff takes place and the scale up occurs. The exchange visits or communities of practice, I think that's very promising in terms of scale up, because you know, for obvious reasons, you know, any school can or a collection of schools can implement that model, drawing on the expertise of their existing staff. The trickiest part is that direct outreach from the implementing NGO that was part of our program. That would require significant scale up in terms of staffing and expenses. We did not experimentally vary these different components to be able to reliably say which of them made the most difference in changing teaching practice. But you know, along the lines of what Janeli was saying about coaching, that outreach piece was most closely related to coaching, and so you know, raises the most important questions for further scale up.
Excellent, thank you. Andy, I know your studies were in India, where everything is at huge scale. Any particular lessons about implementation at scale from the India work?
Yeah, I think, you know, what we show in the study is just an example of, you know, how you can conduct research that is immediately relevant for large scale. And I'm actually pointing to some of these studies on the panel here that do exactly the same thing. So, you know, our study is within a scale up that reaches more than 40,000 schools across the state. And we do representative sampling inside the 2 provinces in that context, and we really believe that our study can speak to this very large context at scale. And we're very much looking forward to doing similar evaluations with other partners. I'm super excited about others who do similar work, and you know, I'm just very eager to do similar work. I feel like we've gone very far by just going this, you know, do something in a small efficacy trial first and then move to scale. I feel like we're now matured as a field in a sense that you know, there's now eagerness to integrate large scale evaluations together with scale ups and have evidence that is very meaningful at scale already.
Yeah, I think Janeli, maybe you can speak to this in terms of the role of the administrative levels within the system for supporting the work of whether it was the coaches or the use of the virtual tools in South Africa. What was that particular role, or did we learn any lessons from your research about the particular role of that district or sub-district, whatever it's called in South Africa, that is the most proximal to the school, in supporting this kind of professional development work?
Well, so we started experimenting with coaching, realizing that in South Africa, the realities are that our subject advisors, who are the district officials who are supposed to be supporting these teachers, their caseload is too high. Often these subject advisors have 200-300 schools that they need to support. They often don't have the resources in terms of field allocation to go to these schools. So although they might have all the expertise and experience to support teachers, they don't have the resources. And that's when we realized, well, if we really want to support teachers, we need to see, is there another way of doing it? And on-site coaching was one way we do this, but we still face the same problem, is we don't have enough on-site coaches trained. We'll need to have a whole training program for them. It's quite expensive. And that's why we started experimenting with virtual coaching, which unfortunately we now see is not as effective. But going forward, I definitely think there's a role for virtual coaches in a bit of a blended model where subject advisors may go, but follow-ups might be done through virtual coaching. So I think understanding the realities is often important in seeing how you can best support teachers.
Yeah, I think those constraints you're referring to are pretty consistently evident in most systems. Charlotte, did you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I think we were quite interested as well in this study, looking at the kind of sub-district level, particularly in Kenya, where we were looking, as I mentioned a moment ago, at the role of the instructional coach cluster level, so around 5 schools. And we found a few things that are quite interesting about the roles. So firstly, we found a really strong correlation between the coach facilitation quality and teachers' self-reported impact on their instructional practice. So obviously it's only correlation at this very early stage, but I think our takeaway is that if you can get the facilitation right at the cluster level and fine-tune that, you can really get more from your communities of practice in terms of their impact on instructional quality. And secondly, we did quite a lot of analysis about what are the coaches actually doing, and what's the role that they're playing. And we learned a lot, but perhaps just a couple of insights. So in these cluster-based models that are across these 5 schools, the analysis showed that the coaches were, I think I mentioned it earlier, they're playing quite a dominant role. They were the main facilitator in, I think, 97% of the communities of practice. They set the agenda, they set the logistics, and at the same time, they were the sort of subject specialists giving teachers professional feedback. I think the counter to that strong role is that our analysis showed that in these cluster models, the teachers were kind of a bit more subdued than in Rwanda. They played less of a role in decision-making on the timings, the agenda, and so on. Compared to Rwanda. So lots of questions come out of this. It's not necessarily one's good, one's bad, but I think there are questions about what should the role be of this at this sort of cluster level, the sub-district level. And an interesting question to consider is, does the cluster model, because it's inherently, I guess, a bit more fragile because it's a collaboration across 5 schools, and it needs a kind of more dominant role played by the coaches to kind of glue it together. Does this somehow undermine teacher ownership and leadership of their own professional development? Is there a trade-off? Maybe there's not. And also, does it matter for instructional outcomes? We're not there yet. We're going to look at that later in the study. But should the coach try and play a different sort of role? So stuff that we'll be able to look at later in the study. And I think also there may be a question around, it may not matter for instructional outcomes, we'll find out, but does it matter for sustainability of the model if teacher ownership is a little bit stifled?
That's really, really interesting and insightful. I think this next set of topics I want to raise definitely build on some of what you were just saying, Charlotte, and Janeli's earlier point about the difficulty of behavior change, essentially getting teachers who have their established ways of doing and the norms within schools that sort of reinforce the established practices. So I want to ask a little bit about that. That the organizational dynamic, the social norms, the organizational norms of schools, of school systems, are kind of the reality within which teachers live and work. And so what insights are we gaining into how the different approaches to teacher professional development, training and coaching are impacting those norms in ways that are helpful and are sort of contributing to changing the norms so that new instructional practices become more acceptable, become more the standard, as well as what ways did we see that prevailing or existing norms present certain constraints that we need to take into consideration. And so I'd love to hear some of you talk to that in particular, like the nature of the job of the teacher and the teacher within their community of practice, in the Charlotte's examples, but the school and the school community as an environment within which teachers have to work. Who wants to kick us off on that one? Any insights into the nature of how to deal with the existing norms and perhaps change them in positive ways?
I'll jump in. So I'll return to a point I made earlier in the Rwandan context about this misalignment between the focus on exams that are still very traditional in nature and this more practical focus that they're trying to implement in the entrepreneurship curriculum and in other subjects. As in many African countries, the system is very focused on the end of year exams and performance on those exams, and there's a lot of pressure on teachers and head teachers to demonstrate that performance. And we found that because this focus largely didn't change, that concern was crowding out the time and effort that teachers could spend on doing more active learning techniques and focusing on more practical skills. And so until those elements are better aligned, I think that there's a severe barrier to changing norms and practices, at least in the Rwandan context.
Great. Janeli, you mentioned the issue of the teacher behavior change in that sense. Do you any particular insight into how the coaching, the in-person coaching, has more of an impact on some of those norms that govern teacher behavior than the virtual coaching was able to address?
Yes, absolutely. I think the one very interesting insight that came from one of the case studies was that teachers almost enter a new program with a certain emotional readiness. So teachers are often used to the district officials coming in and monitoring, and it's often the monitoring is quite strict. Have you done this? Haven't you done this? Have you implemented the new curriculum? But that's often not followed up with supportive advice on how they should change. And the teachers don't have a clear understanding of what's their expectations, what should they be reaching. And often we find with the on-site coaching, the first couple of visits are spent just on building trust, building a relationship, and getting teachers to that point of being emotionally ready to actually admit that some of their practices might not be as useful, and I might be able to change some of our stuff. And it's only once they reach that stage of emotional readiness that they actually start learning and actually start implementing new things. And I think that is one thing that on-site coaches can do much more effectively than a virtual coach is create that safe space, create that emotional space of getting teachers to a point where they are willing to change. And I think that's often missed, definitely with our district officials, and taking district officials through a course of coaching and getting district officials to understand that could be very useful. And I think that is what Charlotte and them are doing. And I think that is a very useful way of thinking about taking some of this forward.
Great. Charlotte or Andy or all three of the other panelists want to jump in. So go ahead, Charlotte, then Andy, then Todd.
Sure, yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating what I think Janeli is saying. So I completely agree. I think a prevailing norm in most education systems, and definitely true in the context of this research, is there's, it's quite top down. There's a hierarchy where teachers are, they expect to be trained by officials and experts, and training is often something that sort of comes from above. And I think, the philosophy of communities of practice is quite countercultural in some ways to that sort of norm. It's about peer-to-peer sharing. It's, horizontal exchange of expertise, support, and maybe resources as well. So it's really interesting in the qualitative analysis in Rwanda, for example, we didn't actually see resistance from head teachers. We thought we might, because it could be a bit of a, culture clash. We didn't see that in the qualitative at all. But we did see that teachers kind of started off with this mindset, a bit like Janeli is saying, that they kind of expected to be told what to do. So, you arrive, and there was this dynamic of where, if the head teacher wasn't there to provide oversight, the head teachers and the teachers, both of them told us that, teachers might arrive late, or maybe the discussion goes off topic. So basically, in the beginning, the community of practice really relied on the head teacher playing quite a strong accountability role, because that was the prevailing norm. And I'm really struck by what Janeli and her colleagues say in their paper about the role of coaches providing an accountability role. I think that's absolutely right. And in the case of Rwanda, actually, that was provided by the head teacher. I think you asked as well, Joe, about sort of how do you reshape those norms. In the qualitative analysis, we did see a shift in teacher mindset over time. So teachers were really talking a lot about how they were sharing problems together, how they were feeling a sense of responsibility to help each other out. I think it's one of my favorite quotes from the qualitative. And you really get this sense of their sense of agency, I think, increasing over time. They're not waiting anymore for the head teacher to kind of tell them what to do. They're driving the communities of practice themselves. And they gave examples of like setting up spin-off communities of practice to share learnings with teachers in other grades. So I think we've seen that, you can shift the norms over time if you set things up in the right way.
Great. Go ahead, Andy.
I wanted to add just
He looks like
not so much about changing the norm, but just documenting what the norms are. This is something that we clearly see in our classroom observations. So we have teachers who really like the activity-based program that is being implemented. They like it and they get it and they're enthused about this. But now when you look at the classroom observations and the particular dimension of instructional quality that gets at activity-based instruction, more pure collaboration in the classroom, more student engagement that we're looking at, and this intervention is looking at, you actually see that this is the lowest dimension of instructional quality, and it is extremely low. Now, this is the dimension that the intervention is actually able to shift, but it's just able to shift it a little. So I think that's important to show you how much there is of an agreement that this is important among teachers, but then once you look at what's happening in the classroom, there's actually a huge discrepancy between these two pieces. Now, the glass half full of this is that even although we just see a small increase on this dimension, we actually see positive effects. So you can read it in either way, but I think it's important just to first document the discrepancy of what teachers like and agree on doing and what's actually happening in the classroom, and then what even small shifts can do on that dimension.
I think that's what you're describing is not unique to teachers, the sort of gulf between what we seek and what we actually do. It's kind of a feature of human nature. Todd, you had wanted to get in on this as well.
Yeah, well, Charlotte actually addressed some of the ideas I was thinking about. We, as I mentioned, had a communities of practice type component in the intervention we studied. We called them exchange visits, but it followed more the Kenyan model of Charlotte's work, where it was a group of teachers from several schools meeting. There was no explicit role for the head teacher. Whereas in their version in Rwanda, the head teacher did play a role. So I was curious about how that played out in their context, and I wonder if more explicitly involving the head teacher would help to break down some of that hierarchy more so than the just peer-to-peer teacher model that we studied.
Great, thanks. I think one last reflection before we go to fielding some of the questions that have been coming in rapid fire through the Q&A. Just in terms of the research, was there anything that you feel you learned from the studies you've been involved in that raised issues about particular constraints that we're not addressing, or some particular insight into the reality of classrooms and the reality of schools, what teachers face, that training, which even the training programs we studied are not taking into account, and maybe just as advice going forward, is something we need to look more closely at.
I'll jump in again here. Another component I've yet to mention in this curricular reform was the prominence of skills labs, they're called in Rwanda, laboratory science-based sessions, double periods, 80 minutes long, where students were encouraged to do group work and present to their peers at the end of the session on some entrepreneurship topic. We found that even though this was a component that was meant to be implemented by all schools because it was part of this new national curriculum, only 8% of the control schools actually scheduled these double periods. So just the daily schedule was a barrier to changing practices in our context.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight, actually. Something as simple as that, right? Just scheduling the day. Anyone else, any other insights into some particular constraints that we perhaps need to think about going forward? Yeah, Andy, did you want to say something?
Let me say one thing. It's not so much about constraints, but just a big question mark for me, and that also came up in the Q&A. So this is these differential effects that we find across boys and girls, and this is not trivial. So this is, and it's great that we're able to actually more than close a gender gap that we see at baseline, and it's great that we are able to find a program that improves learning for girls. But it's a big question mark just for me to understand better what drives these different effects across boys and girls.
Yeah, and one of the things, Janeli, I think you mentioned it, but maybe if you want to say more about it, that in the virtual coaching model, the technology itself or access to technology was not a constraint, right? That it was more an issue of the difference between the presence of the in-person coach versus relying only on the technology. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, so I think it's quite useful to mention that the average age of the teachers that we worked with was 57 years old. So most of them were very close to retirement, which we provided tablets to them with this app that we specially developed. Going into the study, that was our biggest constraint, or our biggest concern is, will they be able to use the tablet? So in our training up front at the start of the year, we worked in a half day that we just allowed them to play on the tablets. We had special activities to get them used to the tablets. But I was amazed at how quickly these teachers picked it up. And we've got data on tablet usage that showed us that the teachers use the tablets. Most teachers use them regularly. We see as the term goes on that there's a definite downward trend in teachers using the tablet. And then all of a sudden in week 7, we see a lot of usage again. And if we go back to looking at the lesson plans, we see, but week 7 is the assessment week. And that is the week that they need to submit information back to the district. So they had to go and see what they need to do for the day. So I think that also showed us that technology is not a barrier. Accountability plays a big role. But what we also realized is with technology, there's often a lot of hidden costs. So for instance, we needed to appoint someone that can support just the technology side of things. So if a tablet breaks and falls, or a teacher deleted the app or something, that's actually, you do need someone to support that. And secondly, you need to think through aspects of hosting and data. And there's all these costs that you don't actually think upfront about, and you learn as you go along the way, which actually doesn't always make technology much more cost effective in the end.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, I think we're at time, and we can start to field some of the questions that have come in from the participants. And thanks to all who have been attending and have been posting questions. There seems to have been a few questions that relate to this following topic, which all of the studies obviously were looking at how training or coaching or combinations thereof or communities of practice led to changes in instructional quality. So there's a question about how in the different studies instructional quality was being measured. Does anyone want to speak to that in terms of the way that instructional quality was measured? What tools, what ways were we trying to get relatively objective appreciations of what actually is happening instructionally? Go ahead, Andy. So that looked like a raised hand.
Yeah, I probably can be speaking for Charlotte and our studies. I think they're both using, Charlotte uses much more than we do, but we primarily focus on the Teach tool that the World Bank developed. In our case, we conducted 4 rounds of classroom observations. And in this case, with the Teach tool, there's trained observers who actually sit an exam on rating these classes, and then rate instruction in timed intervals in terms of 3 broad areas, and those are classroom culture, instruction, and socio-emotional skills, or teaching that promotes socio-emotional skills. And classroom culture taps into stuff like supportive learning environment, whether the teacher uses positive language with the students, for example, and positive behavioral expectations. Instruction goes into lesson facilitation, where the teacher checks for understanding, where the teacher provides critical feedback, practical feedback, and whether the teacher promotes critical thinking. And socio-emotional skills, or the teaching that promotes social-emotional skills, has 3 categories. The one that we're most interested in is one that is called social and collaborative skills. And that is really about whether the teacher promotes students' interpersonal skills, peer learning, and interactive teaching. So in our case, we have 4 rounds of those over the course of 15 months. And then we use more than 1,600 ratings of instructional quality.
Great. Charlotte said you used the Teach tool as well in Rwanda. Maybe you can say a little bit about how you found that tool and if it's providing good objective data.
Yeah, so we're using Teach in both Rwanda and Kenya, and we're also using TSES to look at teacher self-efficacy and collective efficacy. And obviously, we're just coming out of baseline, so we we won't be able to see the changes in time until next year. Yeah, I think that's all I can say at this point.
Okay, great. Todd, do you want to talk about how you were measuring quality of instruction and the active nature of instruction in the secondary?
Sure. We did classroom observations, similar to the other studies, different tool from Teach, but similar idea. But then we also asked the students themselves. We had a list of active instructional techniques that we expected to see as part of the reformed curriculum, and we asked students how frequently they experience those in classes. So we're trying to triangulate across different sources of data, and fortunately we found a pretty consistent story that the training program did increase all of these different measures of active instruction.
Great. And Janeli, did you want to say anything about the particular way in which quality of instruction was measured in South Africa?
Yes, so we strongly considered using the Teach tool, but given that our study looks at supporting teachers in teaching English as a second language specifically, we had a lot of questions on that language aspect. So we ended up going for a tool that was developed by a local researcher that could really drill down on the type of language practices that teachers use in the classroom, and looking at how they are teaching. Both actually, we did classroom observation of both the teaching of English and of home language in these classrooms to understand the spillovers that might be happening when focusing on supporting teachers in one subject specifically.
Great, thanks. So another question that came in, Andy, to the findings from the study in India, and I had this question as well, which is why I wanted to get it on the table. You found that where the community engagement events were also part of the intervention, that it actually had a negative effect. Can you say a little bit about that? I mean, the assumption would be that at worst, it's sort of extraneous. So what do you think might have explained why, in fact, you found lower outcomes in the situations where those events were being held?
Yeah, let me start off by clarifying. We don't find a negative effect. We say that the intervention that doesn't have we favor the intervention without those. The distinction here is really that you have an intervention, and then you have an extra piece that is tagged onto it, which are the community events. The point of the minute is a little bit more negative, but we can really, because of that, we can really rule out positive effects by something like, I think, 2% of a student deviation. So it's not a negative effect on student learning. Now, what we do find on the community events intervention is that on one dimension of instructional quality, we actually find negative effects there. And that's the dimension of classroom culture, which includes something like supportive learning environment or positive behavioral expectations on the Teach tool. And though we don't have, this is me like stepping away from the hard evidence, but one story that could be happening here is that, that these community events naturally induce stress for teachers, and that they change their teaching in a sense that, potentially it makes their teaching more stressful, less supportive, and reduces the amount of positive behavioral expectations that are setting for their students.
Great, thanks. Another question that for everyone on the panel, I think poses an interesting trade-off between content-focused training and pedagogical methods-focused training. And just sort of, if you want to speak to the extent to which the different programs you were studying looked more at one versus the other, or some combination thereof, or whether we have any insight into that balance when we're trying to bring about instructional change. What role does increasing content knowledge play versus increasing pedagogical skill, for lack of a better term? I see some nodding heads. Todd, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very context dependent, as some of the others have already mentioned. If you're talking about more active instructional techniques, the vast majority of teachers in developing countries, if not worldwide, are more steeped in the traditional techniques, both as teachers and prior to that as students. So usually you're starting at a pretty low baseline. So I think that that pedagogical training is likely to be quite important in a wide variety of contexts. The content knowledge, I think, will be more context specific depending on the starting point. We found some modest gains in knowledge of the entrepreneurship curriculum and its concepts in our case, but we don't think that was particularly decisive in the pedagogical changes we saw, because it was a modest increase and the baseline was fairly high to begin with.
Great. Janeli, since the subject matter in South Africa was English as a second language, was teacher knowledge and skill in English itself part of an issue, or was it more focused on techniques for teaching English?
No, that it was a big issue. So our approach to the study was to say we want to support the implementation of the curriculum. We're not changing the curriculum. We're not teaching the curriculum. We just want to support teachers in implementing it. So our assumption going into the study was that they understand the content knowledge and they've got a relatively good command of English. And getting into the study, realized that that's not the case, that most of these teachers are English third, fourth, fifth language speakers that themselves are definitely not confident in English, and then teaching it to a classroom is very challenging to them. The class also not being in English context. And then I think the second thing that came out of that is not only learning the language, but that in learning to read in English, phonics plays a very big role. So if you are struggling to pronounce the sounds, the children don't know how to pronounce the sound. So we often found that the teachers would take the tablets that had some voice recordings and some audio clips on and had the kids just listen to the audio clips. That was never intended. It was always intended as a tool for the teacher. And that made us realize that there's a very strong focus that needs to be placed when teaching a second language on the actual language for the teachers as well.
Great, thanks. Charlotte, in communities of practice, did you find the focus was more on exchanges around instructional approaches, or were teachers also supporting each other in terms of their content knowledge?
Yeah, it was both. So, for example, in Rwanda, the communities of practice, one was in maths, and that included content knowledge and general pedagogical skills. And one was in English. Actually, in the first year, that focused on English language skills and building those skills in the teacher rather than instructional practices. We did see that one of the challenges that teachers had was that they were expected to run the community of practice in English, and they really struggled. So there was some kind of workarounds, code switching, and that we fed back to the program team to try to ease the burden on the teachers. But yeah, in essence, both. Yeah.
Great. So I think we're nearing the end of our session. There are other questions that have come in that we haven't had a chance to respond to, but I believe the practice is that those questions will be shared with all of the members of the panel, and they will be posting responses to those on the RISE website. And if anybody from RISE can tell me if I got that wrong, but I believe that's the process for making sure that all of your questions do get addressed. And thanks again to everyone for participating. Thanks to the panel for your rich studies, as well as your willingness to spend an hour sharing your thoughts and discussing with us all. I would like to try and wrap things up. I think there was one rather interesting question that came in from a longtime colleague, Louise Crouch, sort of asking us if given we're continually finding evidence that training by itself does not lead to the kinds of instructional change we're looking for, that we know is needed to address the learning crisis. And we're seeing more and more that coaching sorts of models are what's effective, coaching combined with the community of practice sort of things that Charlotte's been looking at in Kenya and Rwanda. that we can't wholly rely on technology, as is evidence from the study in South Africa, that even if you were to use technology to enhance a coaching function, that there's still some sort of a blended approach, is what Janeli's research is concluding, and a real focus on quality and the supports that are needed for teachers to have quality instruction and real adoption of more active practices, which I think the two studies from Andy and Todd both were focused on sort of active instructional pedagogy. And so if we're learning this, and sort of what's our responsibility to begin to make the case that the money that's being invested by education systems in professional development, because all education systems spend resources on professional development, usually of a very ineffective kind. And so what's our collective responsibility to begin to make the case more explicitly to policymakers within education systems, to development agencies and development partners of those governments and those ministries of education, that the resources can be better directed to the kinds of investments that provide ongoing support to teachers, that address some of the sort of personal level needs of teachers in terms of, Charlotte in particular, I was struck by your speaking to the issue of self-efficacy, and that whether teachers see themselves as able to change and able to adopt new practices. Well, the conversation we were having earlier about the normative environment and how some of what needs to be happening is investing in and supporting teachers to see their role differently and to understand it differently, and to sort of take ownership of the change at their level, and to have that be reinforced by most immediately the school community, but then the system as well, in some of the ways that we've been talking about. So I think that wraps us up for an hour's worth of discussion. I don't know if Luis Crouch, you're out there. I don't know if we answered your question, but I think you've given us the challenge of taking the message more purposefully about how investment in training and coaching can be more productive and more efficient and effective. So thanks to everyone again. It's been a real pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you.